This is a similar topic, of course, but now we're going to talk about estimating Lorenz curves directly. So when we estimate a Lorenz curve directly, then we can do that integral and estimate the Gini coefficient by getting the area, the appropriate area through integration. Now, when we have this Lorenz function with eta as a function of pi, then of course eta is proportional data, or this increasing proportion, and if you just assume, if you just do a nonlinear least squares or something like that to estimate the Lorenz function, then you're making assumptions that clearly aren't correct. With the proportions can't be normally distributed because they must lie between 0 and 1, and also they're going to be correlated. If the value for one value goes up, another one must go down, and so on. Now the Dirichlet distribution, we've just seen that, it's like a multivariate beta distribution, does have random variables that must lie between 0 and 1 and sum to 1. So that's what it's designed for, and what this paper or this talk is meant to do is to suggest how you could use the Dirichlet distribution to estimate a Lorenz curve. We begin with the Lorenz function, and what we do is assume that the income shares, so not the CDF, but the difference between these cumulative quantities are random variables with mean given by the difference between the two Lorenz functions evaluated at the population in this class less the population in the previous class. So that seems a reasonable kind of assumption. Then the next step then is to assume that these Q's follow a Dirichlet distribution, and if you want both of those assumptions to hold, then what you need to do is, well, first of all, this is the PDF for a Dirichlet distribution. All this gamma stuff out the front's the normalizing constant, and it's got these Q's here. And to make those two assumptions hold, we need to set the alphas equal to something, and in fact the alphas, making the alphas proportional to the difference of the Lorenz function at the two points, the two pi's, will give us what we want. Now, I haven't proved that here, it's proved in the paper, but so we need to introduce this additional parameter lambda, and then it has the characteristics we desire. Now, this lambda is kind of like an inverse variance parameter, we'll see that in a minute. Anyway, so that makes the PDF for Q equal to this. Now that looks terrible, I know. I haven't actually specified what functional form I'm going to use for the Lorenz function yet, and we look at 5 of them, so that's why I've left it in a general, written in this general sense at this time. But even though this looks pretty nasty, again, nasty functions we can handle using Markov chain Monte Carlo. Just a bit on the characteristics of this PDF. It implies variances given by this quantity. So the dependent variable, if you like, is heteroscedastic, and it's also correlated. The correlations are given by this. And you can see how lambda enters into these expressions, so that's why I said it's a bit like an inverse variance. Maximum likelihood estimation. We take the log of the expression I had up there before, and I've been making you look at all these sideways. Sorry. I'll try and get more horizontal. It's not horizontal for me though. So this is a maximum likelihood, a log likelihood function that we can put into our software package and estimate or maximise. For Bayesian estimation, again I used a non-informative prior, just proportional to 1 over this inverse variance parameter, or that plus 1. The plus 1 doesn't really make any difference because lambda is actually very, very big. But I used the plus 1 because it was lambda plus 1 in the denominator of the previous expressions. And there are some inequality constraints for these Lorenz functions. So they have the parameters there have to satisfy certain inequalities for some of these Lorenz functions for them to be Lorenz functions. And so this I beta is a bit like I had yesterday, defining the feasible region. And like in every talk so far, I used again a random walk metropolis algorithm to generate observations. Okay, what Lorenz functions did I use? The data we used is data that, it's fairly old data actually, but the reason we used it was used in a recent Journal of Econometrics article by Surekha et al, and we thought it would be convenient to compare our results to the kinds of results that they got. And we chose a few different functions. This one is a fairly simple Lorenz function. My co-author published a paper on this in Economics Letters, I forget when, early 90s. It's a simple one because it just has one parameter, k, but the disadvantage is because it only has one parameter, it can be quite restrictive and it may not necessarily fit your data very well, and it turns out it does not fit this data very well. The purpose of their paper was to define a class of Lorenz functions which they then proceeded to estimate, and we chose just 3 of those. The thing to notice here is that L3 and L2 are both nested versions of L4. Can we see when that's true? This one's when alpha is equal to 0, and this one is when gamma is equal to 1, I guess. Yeah. So these are both nested versions of that, and then the 5th one is a function that has been used a fair bit in practice. I think Kakwani was the one that suggested it, or at least popularised it in the literature. And I guess this one, there's a special when alpha is equal to 1, and anyway, this one reduces to a particular special case of this one under some parameter restrictions too, and but I don't recall exactly what it is now. But and I think that the restricted version of that is a Pareto or something too. That's quite a well-known one. Now, what we're interested in then is the Gini coefficient defined in this way. Now, how do we get this? Well, if we're doing maximum likelihood estimation, we estimate the parameters, this beta vector of the Lorenz function, get the maximum likelihood estimates, then we just evaluate this for that value beta hat. And if we want to get standard errors on the Gini coefficient, we can use the first order approximation, the so-called delta method, to differentiate this and get expressions for the standard errors. And we did that in an appendix in the paper for all the different Lorenz functions. Now notice it's a fairly easy integral, even although we may have been able to compute this integral analytically for some of the functions, we didn't even bother, because this is a pretty simple integral to do numerically, and just using Shazam you can just use the numerical integration command and define the function and get an answer straight out. So for Bayesian estimation, we do this Metropolis-Hastings algorithm again. We generate large numbers of these betas, and so we might have, say, 70,000, and then we just do this numerical integration 70,000 times and get 70,000 Gini coefficients. But again, that's not a big deal. Again, with Shazam, it's just one command. You just do it for the whole vector of betas, beta estimates, and get one vector of Gini coefficients. A big vector, but just one vector. If we look too much at the numbers, let's make sure we know what these techniques are. Nonlinear least squares is estimates are obtained just by running a nonlinear least squares as pi as a function of, eta as a function of pi, using the particular Lorenz curve. So in a way, nonlinear least squares is equivalent to a normal, it's equivalent to maximum likelihood estimation, assuming a normal likelihood function. Maximum likelihood estimation is, or ML, is using the Dirichlet distribution. So that's maximum likelihood with the Dirichlet distribution. Bayes is our estimates posterior means from our distributions using our Dirichlet distribution. The Sarabia et al. Method of estimation was a somewhat different one. What they defined this, talked about this estimation technique, they called a robust estimation technique. And what they did is, let's give an example. So supposing we were looking at L2, what they would do is they would find every possible subset of two observations. So if you had if you had group data with 20 observations, they would look at the number of ways of drawing 2 from 20. Then they would take each possible combination of two observations. Then they would just equate eta to this for those two observations, and we've got two unknowns, alpha and delta, and they would solve those two nonlinear equations for alpha and delta, and that would give one pair of estimates. Then they would do that again for each possible combination of two observations, so they had a whole stack of different estimates, and then they take the median of those estimates. So that's what they suggest. They suggest it as a robust distribution-free method of estimation, but they don't talk about distributional properties, so I don't know what they are. They then said they went and used bootstrapping to get standard errors, and they didn't talk a lot about how they did the bootstrapping either. I'm a little bit suspicious about it because, as you'll see a bit later on, the bootstrapped standard errors are a lot different from the different measures of uncertainty that I get. First thing just a bit on the order of the results here. I've put L2, L3 and L4 up the top because L2 and L3 are each nested versions of L4. L1 and L5 are non-nested with anything else, and so in that sense I thought it was convenient to look at them separately. And we have the posterior means or sampling theory estimates in each of these columns for the different parameters. Now I think the thing to notice about this is that the Gini coefficient estimates don't really depend very much on what Lorenz curve you assumed or what estimation technique you used. So it doesn't matter what estimation technique you used or what Lorenz function you assumed, they're all about 0.38. Now an exception is, or 0.39, an exception is this one, is the Surekha one, which is quite a bit lower. And I'll talk a bit more about this L4 because when we look at the results further, I think we'll see that this is really an over-parameterization. I think we don't really need to go to this 3-parameter. These two are 2-parameter Lorenz functions. That's a 3-parameter Lorenz function, 1 parameter, 3 parameters. We'll see that it's not. The next thing to notice, I guess, is that even although these Gini coefficients are quite the same, some of the parameters that lead to them are quite different. Now, there's not a lot of difference in the parameter estimates here or here, but look at them over here. The different estimation techniques have led to quite different parameter estimates here and here and here too, even although these Gini coefficients are much the same. Now, these are Brazil. That one was Sweden, and similar sort of conclusions can be made here. There's a couple of differences to note that I've written at the bottom. One is that the level of inequality here in Brazil is much higher than in Sweden, and that's the reason we chose these two countries to because the difference is quite large. Another difference here is that things look quite different for L1, and in this particular case, L1 turned out to be a very poor fit, and so this is the 1-parameter Lorenz function, and that's why these ones here are a lot different from the others. But similar results, bit more variation in parameter estimates, some of these other ones. Again, these L4 ones vary a lot, but again, I think I can explain those later. But let me just point one thing out to you, which maybe is worth noting at this stage, is that there's quite a difference between the maximum likelihood estimate and the Bayes estimate. And what we've got here is a non-informative prior, remember? And so the posterior is pretty similar to the likelihood function. And so another way of looking at the maximum likelihood estimate is the mode of the posterior, yet the mode is quite different from the mean. There's a number of things we can draw from this, I think. The first one is that the Bayesian posterior standard deviations are much larger than maximum likelihood standard errors. So if we compare that and that, for example, let's just do it for Gini coefficients. So that's bigger than that, it's bigger than that, bigger than that, bigger than that. And the conclusion from that, I think, is that with maximum likelihood, you're using asymptotic results to make finite sample inferences, therefore you can be making mistakes. Your maximum likelihood standard errors do not necessarily reflect appropriately the uncertainty in estimation. So even although the Gini coefficients were similar, the standard errors for the Bayesian estimates more appropriately reflect the uncertainty. The second thing is that these bootstrap standard errors of Sarabia et al. Are much lower than anything else, and I didn't work them out for the Gini coefficient, but for the parameters, they I guess they're not uniformly lower, are they? Here's one that's much bigger. Anyway, they're very different, and I did wonder about their validity. Also, nonlinear least squares standard errors are quite different. So making the assumption of normally distributed errors when it's questionable can have an impact on your uncertainty measures. Yeah, the next point I had is the information about the Gini coefficient, or in other words, the standard errors, it depends heavily on the Lorenz function. And the reason I hesitated was looking at the data, I wasn't sure that was true. But there is a lot of difference here. If we look at L5, 0031, 0046, we look at L1 here, the standard posterior standard deviation is quite different, and that's quite different again from this one. Although apart from this one, there's not a lot of difference there. Maybe in Brazil there is. Let's have a look at Brazil. Yeah, here there's a lot more variation, isn't there? This one, this one, this one. These three are about not all that different, I guess, but they're quite dramatically different from the posterior standard deviations there. I've got a few pictures here. Pictures are always nicer than all these graphs, to try and just illustrate some of these things. Now, I mentioned the question of comparing the Bayesian posterior. Okay, let's talk a little bit about pictures here. Each of these pictures is designed to illustrate the points I've just made. And the first one is that the maximum likelihood, this last question indicated there are exceptions to this. This one's designed to show that when the maximum likelihood standard error is bigger than the Bayesian posterior standard deviation, then this is an example of the error you make by using asymptotic approximation is one way of viewing this. And so I'm doing, as I did yesterday at one case, I'm assuming that if you're a sampling theory kind of person and you use maximum likelihood, deep down you're a Bayesian, and deep down what you're really thinking that you have a normal posterior centred at the maximum likelihood estimate and with standard deviation equal to the standard error. And if you do that, then this is your maximum likelihood posterior, if you'll let me use such a terrible expression, and this one here is my normal posterior. So it's got fatter tails. This is one's for alpha, notice, for one of the parameters. This is one for one of the Gini coefficients. Now, one of the other conclusions I made was that the posterior mean for the Gini coefficient was not sensitive to the Lorenz function specification. There was one exception for that in Brazil, but the posterior standard deviation was very sensitive to the Lorenz curve specification, and you can see that there. All centred around the same spot, but very different dispersions, and that's Sweden. And here's one for Brazil, same kind of result, although there has been some sensitivity of the posterior mean in this case as well. Okay, now I have some goodness of fit measures for each of these functions, and these are not posterior odds, I'm embarrassed to say. They're a sampling theory measure. This is Tile's information accuracy, inaccuracy measure. So what I did here is get the predictions. To get the Bayesian predictions, I used the posterior means, and I computed this measure. So the smaller the particular value, the better the fit it is. So the bigger the value, the bigger the information inaccuracy. Now you can see in this case that L1 does not fit at all well. So this is the this disappointed my co-author because it was her function, or she thinks of it as her function, but nevertheless it only has one parameter, and so it's not nearly as flexible. L5 generally fits the best, so that's the 3-parameter Kakwani type distribution. I don't know if I should attribute it totally to him, but he has used it a lot. And generally these ones are about the same, although L2 doesn't perform at all well when you for Brazil compared to L3 and L4. Now, these things help explain quite a lot. In fact, if you do hypothesis tests, either likelihood ratio type tests, or you plot posteriors and you look where most of the probability mass is, you will find that in the case of Sweden, if you tested L2 against the more general L4, or if you tested L3 against the more general L4, you would not reject either L2 or L3. So in other words, L4 is an unnecessary over-parameterization relative to these. And the same thing happens with Brazil, except you do reject L2. So if you test for Brazil, L2 against L4 and L3 against L4, then what happens is you reject L2 but not L3. But the same things can be said. L4 is an unnecessary over-parameterisation. And that, I think, is the reason some of these results for L4 are so funny, is that you've got this extra parameter in there and you cannot estimate things terribly accurately. And that leads to this funny kind of results. L2 with a particular parameter restriction leads to the Lorenz function from the Pareto distribution. Now, these numbers here are, that's 0.65, that's 0.85, and that's 1 up there. This is 1.005. You can see how the inequality constraint that's required to make this a Lorenz function has an impact there. So these are plots of the observations. If you ask your printer to print this, it takes it about 10 minutes to find the dots before it'll print. Okay, when A equals 1 and D equals 1, this L5 reduces to the Pareto distribution of Kakwani, and so this 1 is sort of way out here. So there's obviously no posterior probability out there, and so we can conclude that we can't really restrict it in that way. And similarly here, 1 is round about there. But you can see there's quite high correlation between these parameters too when you estimate them. Alpha equals 0 makes L4 reduce to L3. And so this is what I meant when I said I eyeballed the posterior. There's a lot of probability at alpha equals 0 here, a lot of probability at alpha equals 0 here. And these are very spread out, and that's consistent with the likelihood ratio test, that's consistent with the fact that the information inaccuracy terms didn't change very much. Now, this one also explains why your Bayesian and maximum likelihood estimates are so different. Your maximum likelihood estimates are going to be close to the modes. So your maximum likelihood estimates are going to be round about here, somewhere there. But the Bayesian estimates, and if we go back to that table, you'll see they were very close to 0. But the Bayesian estimates are going to be the means of these distributions. So the Bayesian estimates are going to be out here somewhere. And so they're much bigger. For L2, we require gamma equals 1. And these are the posterior PDFs for gamma. Now, notice that given these posterior PDFs, 1 is a reasonable value here with L4, but not for Brazil. And that again was consistent with this information inaccuracy measures, where the fit for L2 for Brazil was appreciably worse than L4, but that wasn't the case with Sweden. And so these kind of observations, where there's not much probability around here, quite a lot around there, are consistent with both that information inaccuracy measure and the likelihood ratio test. Now, you can see these things are quite spread out, pretty diffuse. I mean, big posterior standard deviations. And that explains, I think, why some of these coefficients, individual coefficients, had quite high posterior standard deviations, but when you got the Gini coefficient, it was estimated accurately. And here, a couple more scatter plots that show how highly correlated those things are. And so it's interesting too, we all learn about, when we study statistics, we all learn about how joint tests don't give you the same result as individual tests. Now here's a really classic example. Let's take Sweden here. We accepted that alpha could be 0. We accepted that gamma could be 1. But can we accept both those things? This is the point where alpha equals 0 and gamma equals 1. No posterior probability at all. But if we just consider gamma equals 1 by itself, lots of dots over here. If we consider alpha equals 0 by itself, lots of dots over there. So, so there's quite a lot of difference between estimating these things separately and joint functions of them together. So let me see where I'm up to. I must be nearly getting finished here. I've talked about that one, that we can't, L5 is the one that fits best, and in terms of seeing whether a restricted version of that could be satisfactory, the answer was no. L4 led to quite unstable, if you like, estimates, and I think the reason is that it's an unnecessary over-parameterization. In terms of L4, which did produce some funny kind of results, and I think we can explain that in terms of the nature of the posterior PDFs and where the mode and medians lie. L4 was better than L2 for Brazil, but not Sweden. And again here, same thing. This strange behaviour in L4, we can accurately estimate the Gini coefficient, even although we can't estimate the individual parameters accurately. And if I did a likelihood ratio test on Sweden, I do reject accept the joint hypothesis, but not for Brazil. Well, I think that winds it up. So I'm happy to take questions.